Hey guys, tonight we're talking about the drug that built the modern world, broke the modern world, and then somehow got prescribed to your kid for math class. That's right, amphetamines. Not the shadowy, whispered kind you hear about in cautionary tales, or the polished kind your dentist takes to get through a Tuesday. I mean the full, sprawling, 100-year saga of the stimulant that America has been absolutely incapable of quitting since 1927. So before you get comfortable, let me just say a massive thank you to the viewer who suggested this one. You know who you are. Your recommendation landed in my inbox and I thought, yes, this is exactly the kind of history that sounds boring, looks respectable in a lab coat, and is absolutely unhinged once you peel back the surface. Your suggestions genuinely shape this channel, and I mean that. It means everything. Now, if you enjoy what I do here, please like the video and subscribe, but only if you actually enjoy it. No pressure. Leave a comment telling me where you're listening from and what time it is for you. And if you'd rather listen while you do something else entirely, the channel is now on Spotify. Link is in the description. Go find it. Now. Dim those lights. Turn on a fan. Pull your blanket up. Put your phone face down. And let's ease into this together. But first let's pause for a moment. Have you ever wondered how a chemical discovered by accident in a Berlin laboratory ended up in the lunch boxes of World War II soldiers? Did the United States government once told its troops to take amphetamines before going into battle, the way a soccer mum now tells her kids to take their vitamins? Was there a version of Adderall in the 1950s that housewives were prescribed just for being tired? Did truck drivers, students, fighter pilots, Olympic athletes, and the United States Air Force all share the same basic drug at some point in history? And is it possible that one of the most controlled substances in modern America was once sold over the counter in a little blue inhaler at your local drugstore for 35 cents? Congratulations. You've just woken up at 1927. You're in a pharmaceutical laboratory in Los Angeles. It smells like chemicals and ambition. Someone nearby has just synthesized something new, something that makes you feel like you could read every book in the library, run a marathon, and have a very productive argument about taxes all before lunch. Nobody knows what it's going to do in the next 100 years. Yet, it did not begin with a grand plan. There was no shadowy pharmaceutical executive rubbing his hands together in a boardroom. No government contract, no sinister agenda. Amphetamine was born the way most world-altering things are born, by accident, in a laboratory, by a man who was actually trying to solve a completely different problem. In 1927, a chemist named Gordon Alice was working in Los Angeles, attempting to synthesize a cheaper substitute for ephedrine, a natural compound derived from a Chinese herb that was being used to treat asthma. Ephedrine worked. The problem was that it was expensive, hard to source, and entirely dependent on imports from China. Alice wanted something synthetic, something reproducible. What he created instead was a compound called beta-phenyl isopropylamine. He injected it into himself on a Tuesday, the way scientists apparently did things in 1927, and within minutes he felt an extraordinary rush of wakefulness, confidence, and mild euphoria. His heart was racing. His thoughts were sharp. His nasal passages were magnificently clear. He had, without intending to, just discovered amphetamine. Now, to be fair to Gordon Alice, he did write everything down. He was a careful, methodical man, and his notes from that self-experiment describe the effects with the measured understatement of someone who is trying very hard to remain scientific while also feeling like he could personally reorganize the Library of Congress. He noted the elevated pulse. He noted the insomnia that followed. He noted that for hours after the injection he was unable to sleep, and found this, in the language of his notes, somewhat inconvenient. What he did not note, because he had no way of knowing, was that he had just set in motion one of the most consequential pharmaceutical stories in human history. Alice was not the first person to synthesize the compound. A Romanian chemist named Lazar Edeleanu had actually produced it back in 1887 as part of a broader investigation into organic chemistry, and then set it aside because it didn't seem useful for anything in particular. This is one of history's small jokes. The most widely used stimulant in modern medicine was synthesized, deemed uninteresting, and filed away for 40 years. If Edeleanu had been slightly more curious about its effects, or Alice slightly less, determined to solve the ephedrine problem, the entire trajectory of the 20th century might have looked different. Or it might have looked exactly the same, because as history would demonstrate, the demand that amphetamine eventually filled was not created by the drug. The drug was created to fill a demand that was already there, waiting patiently, in the form of human beings who wanted to feel more awake, more focused, and more capable than they currently did. Alice patented his compound in 1932 and licensed it to Smith, Kline, and French Pharmaceuticals, a Philadelphia company that saw the commercial potential in a drug that opened airways and also, incidentally, made people feel extraordinary. The company was not particularly interested in the euphoria. They were interested in the decongestant effect, which was real and useful and could be marketed without raising uncomfortable questions. The euphoria, they would discover soon enough, was something the public was going to find on its own. Within a decade of that Tuesday injection in a Los Angeles laboratory, amphetamine would be circulating through American culture at a scale that Gordon Alice, careful and methodical as he was, had not fully anticipated. He had wanted to help people breathe through their colds. He had also accidentally handed the 20th century its favourite molecule. If you wanted to understand how America first encountered amphetamine, you need to picture a small silver inhaler sold over the counter at every drugstore in the country for 35 cents. No prescription. No warning label beyond something vague about not exceeding the recommended dose. No concept whatsoever of what was about to happen. Smith, Kline and French Pharmaceuticals licensed Alice's compound in 1934 and released it to the public as Benzedrine, a decongestant inhaler designed to help people breathe through colds and hay fever. The inhaler contained a strip of paper soaked in, the drug, and when you inhaled through it, the amphetamine vapor opened your airways and left you feeling, as early users noted, remarkably alert. Unreasonably alert. Alert in a way that made you want to reorganize your kitchen at 2 a.m. and then write a letter to your congressman. Within a few years, Americans were cracking open the inhalers not to treat their sinuses, but to soak the paper strips in coffee and drink the whole thing. This was objectively an alarming development. It was also from the perspective of a Depression-era American who was exhausted, underpaid, and in possession of 35 cents, a fairly logical one. The Benzedrine inhaler was cheap, legal, available everywhere, and delivered a stimulant effect that was genuinely useful if you needed to stay awake, concentrate, or simply feel better than your circumstances warranted. The Great Depression had a way of making people feel tired in a very specific and persistent way, not just physically tired, but tired of the whole situation, and something that made you feel energized and capable and slightly more optimistic than the economic data suggested you should be, was going to find a market. It found several. The company's advertising was almost aggressively boring, which in retrospect seems like either a masterpiece of restraint or a missed opportunity, depending on how you look at it. Benzedrine was marketed as a nasal decongestant, full stop. The ads showed people with colds. They emphasized the inhaler's medical respectability. They did not mention the racing heart or the sleepless nights, or the way that several thousand Americans were already treating the product as a recreational drug with benefits. The company knew, because physicians were writing to them about it. the company responded by noting that the drug was safe when used as directed and that misuse was the responsibility of the individual. This argument was used again, with slight variations, for the next several decades. By the late 1930s, reports of Benzedrine misuse had become common enough that the American Medical Association began making cautious noises about the inhaler's availability. There were stories of people buying dozens of inhalers at a time. There were emergency room cases that involved not nasal congestion, but cardiac arrhythmia and extreme agitation. There were jazz musicians, it was reported, who had developed a particular fondness for the product. The AMA issued a mild warning. The inhalers remained on shelves. Because this was America in 1938, and the idea that the government should restrict something available at every corner drugstore was not yet a reflex. It would become one. But first, there would be another 15 years of fairly unrestricted access, during which time the culture would find many creative uses for a legal stimulant that cost less than a sandwich and required no explanation to purchase. The Benzedrine inhaler remained, available without a prescription until 1949. By that point, the paper strips inside them had become so thoroughly associated with non-medicinal use that the company reformulated the product to make it harder to extract. The damage, if you want to call it that, had been done. A generation of Americans had learned that stimulants were available, affordable, and quite effective at making a difficult world feel temporarily manageable. That knowledge does not unlearn itself. Before the soldiers, before the housewives, before the truckers and the athletes and the executives, there were the students. Almost immediately after Benzedrine hit pharmacy shelves, word began to spread across American college campuses that if you cracked open one of those little silver inhalers and knew what to do with it, you could stay awake for an entire exam period without once feeling the need to sleep, eat, or question your life choices. This was the 1930s. Students were already under enormous pressure. The Depression had made college both more important and harder to afford, and the idea of a chemical that could squeeze more hours of productivity out of a single night was almost irresistible. Reports began reaching physicians of students arriving at health centres with racing pulses, bizarre moods, and the unsettling conviction that they had just figured out everything. The university administrations were alarmed. The pharmaceutical company was not. The student use of Benzedrine in the 1930s was not hidden. It was talked about openly in dormitory common rooms, written about in campus newspapers, and described in personal letters with a casualness that suggests the people doing it did not think of themselves as doing anything particularly transgressive. They thought of themselves as studying, with assistance. The distinction felt important to them. Whether it feels important to you probably depends on when you were born and whether you have ever written a 15-page paper on the history of the Roman Senate at 3 o'clock in the morning, staring at a blank page, with 8 hours until it was due. What the students discovered, and what would be rediscovered by every subsequent generation of stimulant users in academic settings, was that amphetamine produced a specific and seductive kind of focus, a narrowing of attention onto the immediate task that felt, while it was happening, like competence. Your thoughts moved quickly. The connections between ideas seemed obvious. The words came without the usual hesitation and revision, and staring at the ceiling while wondering if you had chosen the right major. Whether the work produced under these conditions was actually better than what you would have produced rested and well fed is a question the students did not particularly pause to investigate. It felt better, which is a different thing, and in the short run, the difference does not announce itself. The long run arrived, as it tends to, eventually. The same health centre physicians who were seeing students with racing hearts were also seeing students who had been awake for 3 days, and were now experiencing what one medical report of the era described as an agitated state of unreasonable confidence, followed by a collapse of mood severe enough to prevent functioning. This is a clinical way of saying that the student had crashed hard into a depression that felt all the worse for the artificial height from which it descended. Some of these students recovered and went back to studying by conventional means. Some of them came back to the health centre to ask if the physician had any more of those Benzedrine inhalers. A small but notable number became the first documented cases of amphetamine dependency in American college populations, a category of problem that would grow considerably in the following 80 years without ever being solved. The university administration's response was to write letters to Smith, Klein and French, expressing concern. The company's response was to note that the product was a decongestant and to suggest that misuse was beyond their control. Both parties moved on. The students kept studying. The Second World War changed everything about amphetamine, who used it, how much of it circulated, and what governments were willing to quietly overlook in the name of military efficiency. By the late 1930s, several nations had already begun experimenting with stimulants for their troops. The logic was straightforward and not entirely unreasonable. Soldiers needed to stay awake on long marches, maintain focus under fire, and suppress the kind of fear that might otherwise make a person reconsider charging into a fortified position. Britain issued Benzedrine tablets to RAF pilots and eventually to the broader armed forces. The United States followed. By some estimates, American forces consumed around 200 million Benzedrine tablets over the course of the war, a number so large it barely fits in the imagination. You were a tired soldier somewhere in the Pacific, and your sergeant handed you a small tablet and told you it would help. It did help. It also rewired something, slowly, in millions of men who would eventually come home. The military's enthusiasm for amphetamine was not, it should be said, the product of ignorance. The people making these decisions knew what the drug did. They had read the medical literature. They had seen the reports from university health centres and civilian physicians. They had made a calculation that the short-term performance benefits outweighed the long-term risks, in a context where the long-term risk of not performing was a bullet, and they had issued the tablets. This is a calculation that is easier to criticise from a comfortable distance than it is to second-guess from inside a war. But it is also a calculation that established a precedent, that the United States military considered amphetamine a legitimate tool of combat readiness, a precedent that would not be revisited for several decades. The experience of taking amphetamine in a combat context was, by all accounts, genuinely useful in the short term, and genuinely strange in ways that took time to understand. Soldiers described staying awake for extraordinary stretches of time without feeling the distress that normal sleep deprivation produces, the confusion, the hallucinations, the physical deterioration. The drug suppressed all of that. What it could not suppress, and what became apparent when the drug wore off, was that the body had still been awake for 40 hours and was not interested in discussing the matter politely. The crash that followed extended use was severe enough that military physicians began issuing guidelines about limiting consumption. Guidelines that were followed with the consistency you would expect from men who were also being shot at. The post-war period brought millions of veterans home, some of whom had become accustomed to the tablets, some of whom had not, and all of whom were returning to a civilian landscape that had no particular framework for understanding stimulant dependency. The Veterans Administration was not yet thinking about it in those terms. The medical community was not yet thinking about it in those terms. The pharmaceutical companies were very much thinking about it, but in the direction of identifying a large population of potential customers rather than in the direction of treatment. The men came home. Some of them found civilian pharmacies well stocked with amphetamine products that required only a prescription, and some of them found sympathetic physicians. The transition was not always clean. While the Allied forces were quietly handing out Benzedrine tablets, Germany had developed its own amphetamine compound, and the German version didn't come with the same mild, almost apologetic energy of the American product. Pervitin, a methamphetamine tablet manufactured by the Pharmaceutical company in Berlin, was distributed to Wehrmacht soldiers beginning in 1939, with an enthusiasm that can only be described as reckless. Soldiers called it Panzerschokolade, tank chocolate. It was issued before major operations to keep troops awake, aggressive, and indifferent to pain. During the fall of France in 1940, the speed of the German advance, the terrifying, almost inhuman pace at which armoured divisions crossed terrain that military planners had assumed would slow them, was partly attributed by later historians to the enormous quantities of Pervitin consumed by troops who simply did not stop to sleep. The drug worked, in the short term, with brutal efficiency. What it did to the men who took it over months and years of combat is a different and significantly darker story. The German military's relationship with Pervitin was initially enthusiastic and eventually alarmed, which is a trajectory that most of amphetamine's institutional relationships tend to follow if you give them enough time. In the early months of the war, military commanders were reporting that the drug was producing extraordinary results. Soldiers who could march through the night, who showed no fear, who maintained aggression under conditions that would have broken an unmedicated unit. Heinrich Böll, who would later win the Nobel Prize in Literature, wrote letters home from the front asking his parents to send him more Pervitin, describing the tablets with a frankness that suggests he saw no particular reason to be discreet about it. He called them wonderful. He asked for them repeatedly. He was not unusual. What began to emerge as the war progressed and the drug continued to be issued was a pattern that military physicians found increasingly difficult to ignore. Soldiers who had been taking Pervitin for extended periods were showing symptoms that did not resemble normal fatigue. There were psychotic episodes. There were soldiers who had become, in the clinical language of the time, dependent, who could not function without the drug, but who also could not function well on it anymore after months of continuous use. The drug had begun eating through the performance it was designed to produce. By 1941, the German military had begun issuing stricter guidelines about Pervitin use, requiring prescriptions and attempting to limit distribution. The soldiers found ways around the restrictions, as soldiers tend to do. The tablets continued to circulate. The civilian population had also been exposed. Pervitin was available to the German public in the late 1930s without a prescription, sold in pharmacies and even given briefly and horrifyingly as a confection, a chocolate treat called Hildebrand Praline that contained 3 milligrams of methamphetamine per piece, marketed to people who needed a pick-me-up. The product was pulled from civilian sale relatively quickly after concerns arose. The concerns did not stop the military distribution, which continued in various forms until the end of the war. By 1945, the Third Reich had consumed an estimated 200 million Pervitin tablets. The ruins it left behind were not only architectural. If you picture the ideal American housewife of the 1950s, the pressed apron, the sparkling kitchen, the cheerful smile deployed before the coffee had finished brewing, it is worth knowing that a meaningful number of those women were running on prescription amphetamines. By the post-war period, amphetamine-based medications were being marketed to physicians as treatments not just for obesity and depression, but for something that could be loosely described as the general exhaustion of being a woman in America in 1953. The pills had various brand names, various dosages, and the same basic effect. They suppressed appetite, elevated mood, and allowed a person to accomplish an almost absurd amount of domestic labour without once feeling the urge to sit down and think about whether any of it was making her happy. Doctors prescribed them with little hesitation. Women took them with little question. The pharmaceutical companies advertised them in medical journals with copy that today reads like a very dark joke, suggesting that the tired, overwhelmed housewife was simply experiencing a chemical imbalance that could be corrected with a morning tablet. The advertisements directed at physicians were extraordinary documents, and not in a complimentary sense. They featured illustrations of women who appeared agitated, distracted, or visibly unhappy, accompanied by copy that attributed their distress to identifiable neurochemical causes, rather than, for example, the fact that they were expected to raise children, maintain a home, support a husband's career, and perform cheerfulness as a kind of full-time occupation with no days off and no compensation. The solution offered was pharmacological. The Benzedrine or the Desoxin or whatever the brand name happened to be would smooth out the mood, sharpen the focus, reduce the appetite, and return the patient to a state of productive, pleasant functionality. The advertisements did not ask whether the problem might be structural rather than chemical. That was not the kind of question pharmaceutical advertising was designed to raise. The women who took these medications were not, for the most part, seeking to get high. They were seeking to get through the day. The distinction matters, even if the pharmacology is identical. Many of them found that the pills did exactly what was promised. They felt more energetic, more capable, less overwhelmed by the gap between what was expected of them and what they had the bandwidth to provide. Some of them lost weight, which the culture of the 1950s considered an additional benefit. Some of them slept badly, felt anxious, experienced irritability that their husbands found confusing and their physicians attributed to the wrong dosage. The dosage was adjusted. The prescription was refilled. The cycle continued. Betty Friedan, whose 1963 book The Feminine Mystique gave a name to the specific despair that post-war domestic life had produced in a generation of educated women, described something she called the problem that has no name, a pervasive dissatisfaction, a sense of purposelessness, a quiet suffocation beneath the surface of a life that looked, from the outside, perfectly adequate. Friedan did not focus extensively on the amphetamines, but the two phenomena were related. The pills were, in a very real sense, one of the culture's preferred solutions to the problem that had no name, not addressing the conditions that produced the distress, but chemically adjusting the person experiencing it to feel less distressed. It was efficient. It was profitable. It was not, in the long run, sufficient. While mainstream America was swallowing amphetamines in tidy little prescribed doses, a different group of Americans was approaching the same compound with considerably more enthusiasm and considerably less medical supervision. The beat writers, Jack Kerouac, Allen Ginsberg, William S. Burroughs, and their various companions were among the earliest and most vocal literary adopters of amphetamine as a creative tool. Kerouac famously wrote the scroll version of On the Road in approximately 3 weeks on a diet of coffee, cigarettes, and Benzedrine, the words tumbling out in one long, barely punctuated rush of consciousness that his editor would later spend months trying to reshape into something a publisher could sell. Ginsberg wrote poems on it. Burroughs analysed it with the detached curiosity of a man who had tried most things at least once, and found them all intellectually interesting. The Beats were not evangelical about amphetamine the way they were about some other substances. They were more observational, almost clinical, but their work helped establish a cultural association between stimulant use and artistic production that would persist for decades. The specific appeal of amphetamine for writers, as opposed to other substances that the Beats also investigated, had to do with its relationship to language. When Kerouac described the scroll of On the Road being written in a continuous, unedited torrent, he was describing something that amphetamine produces in many users, a sense that thoughts are arriving faster than they can be transcribed, that the connections between ideas are suddenly visible and urgent, that the internal editor who normally interrupts the creative process with doubts and revisions has been temporarily relocated to another room. Whether this is a feature or a bug is a question that the first draft of any piece of writing cannot answer. The scroll required significant editing. Kerouac's editor Malcolm Cowley reportedly described working on it as an experience of considerable patience. Ginsberg's relationship with amphetamine was complicated and long-lasting, and he wrote about it with a directness that was characteristic of his general approach to documenting his own interior life. His poem Howl, written in 1955 and published in 1956, opens with images of his generation destroyed by madness, starving, hysterical, naked, a description that encompasses a range of experiences, but that was rooted in the specific social world of young, creative, economically marginal people in post-war America, a world in which amphetamine was among the more readily available tools for managing exhaustion and depression. Ginsberg did not romanticize the drug. He was too honest and too rigorous for that. But he did not pretend it hadn't been part of the landscape. What the Beat Generation contributed to the cultural history of amphetamine was not a new use pattern, but a new visibility. These writers were articulate, published and read by people who did not themselves inhabit the world of the jazz club or the cheap hotel room. They brought the conversation about stimulants into literary culture, into university classrooms, into coffee shops where people read paperbacks and argued about consciousness and freedom. In doing so, they helped produce the conditions in which the 1960s counterculture would encounter amphetamine, not as a medical product or a military tool, but as a substance with a cultural biography, a drug that came with a story already attached to it. By the mid-1950s, American pharmaceutical companies had discovered something that would define the industry's relationship with amphetamines for the next several decades. People very much wanted to lose weight, and amphetamines made people not want to eat. This was not a subtle discovery. The appetite-suppressing effect of amphetamine had been noted almost from the beginning, but it was during the post-war consumer boom that it was transformed into a full-scale commercial enterprise. Diet pills flooded the market under names that suggested medical seriousness: Benzedrine, Obertrol, Desoxin, and were prescribed by physicians to patients whose weight was considered medically inconvenient, which in 1956 meant a fairly wide range of people. Women were the primary target. The cultural pressure to maintain a particular body type was intense, the medical community was unsentimental about it, and the pills worked, in the short term, with impressive efficiency. Patients lost weight. They also, in many cases, developed racing hearts, anxiety, insomnia, and a general sense of agitation that their physicians reassured them was probably just a minor side effect. The word probably was doing a lot of work in those conversations. What was being observed in physician offices across the country, had anyone been aggregating the data, was an early and fairly clear picture of amphetamine's side effect profile, the cardiovascular stress, the disrupted sleep, the mood dysregulation, the potential for dependency. Individual physicians saw individual patients. The pattern, if you were looking at any one case, was easy to attribute to something other than the medication. The patient was anxious by nature. The patient had a pre-existing cardiac condition. The patient was not following the prescribed dosage. The pattern became harder to ignore as the decade progressed, but the appetite suppression market was generating enough revenue that the ignoring continued for longer than it probably should have. Obertrol is worth particular attention because it is the direct ancestor of Adderall, the compound that would eventually become the most prescribed amphetamine medication in American history. It was a mixture of amphetamine salts, developed in the 1960s specifically as a diet drug, and it was prescribed to exactly the population you would expect, primarily women, primarily for weight management, by physicians who were operating in a regulatory environment that did not require them to demonstrate much beyond that the drug produced the intended effect. It did produce the intended effect. The weight loss was real. The method of achieving that weight loss, reducing appetite through stimulant action in the brain, was not particularly gentle, but it was effective, and effectiveness was the standard being applied. The diet pill market of the 1950s and 60s was not a fringe phenomenon. It was mainstream, physician-directed, and enormously profitable. Millions of prescriptions were written. Millions of women took these medications for months or years at a time, some of them cycling on and off as the weight returned when the prescriptions were discontinued, some of them developing dependencies that their physicians did not initially recognize as such, because the framework for understanding stimulant dependency in the medical community was still being constructed. The FDA would eventually tighten restrictions on amphetamine-based diet medications, but not before the market had established something important, that in America, the desire to feel and perform better than your baseline was a commercial opportunity of almost limitless scale. There is a specific and very American relationship between amphetamines and the open highway, and it did not begin with the counterculture or the rock and roll era. It began with considerable practicality in the trucking industry sometime in the 1940s and accelerated sharply through the 50s and 60s. Long-haul trucking was, and remains, a profession defined by time pressure and physical endurance. Drivers were expected to cover enormous distances on tight schedules, often through the night, often alone, often through the kind of monotonous terrain that has a way of pulling your eyelids down regardless of how much coffee you have consumed. Benzedrine and later amphetamine tablets were circulating through truck stops well before they became a cultural cliché. Traded informally between drivers the way recipes are traded between neighbours. The trucking industry's adoption of stimulants was practical, informal, and almost entirely invisible to the regulatory apparatus that was, in the 50s, still figuring out that any of this might be a problem. The truck stop, as a cultural institution, is worth understanding as the setting in which much of mid-century American amphetamine use actually happened. It was a world of fluorescent lights and bad coffee, and men who had been driving for 16 hours and needed to drive for 8 more. The informal economy of stimulants that operated in these spaces was not organised or hierarchical. It was more like a standing informal arrangement among people who shared a problem and had found a solution that worked, for now, well enough. Drivers who had prescriptions shared with drivers who didn't. Drivers who had none found other sources. The pharmaceutical company that manufactured the product bearing the Blue Cross logo of Benzedrine was not unaware that its product was popular with this community. It didn't advertise to them directly. It also did not take significant steps to prevent the circulation. The physical experience of driving long distances on amphetamine is not, by most accounts, particularly pleasant after the first several hours. The initial alertness gives way over an extended shift to something more edged and less comfortable, a wired vigilance that is attentive but joyless, a hyper-awareness of the road that sits alongside a growing difficulty concentrating on anything except the immediate task of staying in the lane. Drivers describe the feeling as useful but not pleasant, a means to an end, not an experience to be sought for its own sake. The crash that followed, once the delivery was made and the driver finally had the chance to sleep, was described with considerably more feeling. What the trucking industry established, and what would be replicated in every subsequent professional context that adopted stimulants, was a pragmatic culture around the drugs that stripped away most of the moral complexity and asked only whether the thing worked. It worked. You stayed awake. The delivery was made. The fact that you felt terrible afterward was your own problem and the next shift's problem, not the current shift's problem. This framing, productivity now, consequences later, is not unique to truck drivers or to amphetamine. It is a very human way of making decisions under pressure, but it found in amphetamine an unusually reliable enabler, and the relationship between the two became one of the defining features of working-class stimulant use in post-war America. For the first few decades of amphetamine's commercial existence, the Food and Drug Administration occupied a position that could generously be described as relaxed. The agency had limited authority over pharmaceutical marketing in the pre-1962 era, and what authority it had was exercised with a patience that, in retrospect, seems almost philosophical. Benzedrine inhalers were sold over the counter until 1949, by which point the evidence that people were methodically dismantling them to consume the drug in ways the manufacturer had not intended was so overwhelming that even the most optimistic regulatory posture could not ignore it. Prescription requirements were eventually tightened. Amphetamine was moved to prescription-only status, and then, with the regularity of a very slow clock, the FDA continued to approve new amphetamine-based medications for new indications because the pharmaceutical lobby was skilled. The public appetite for these drugs was enormous, and the science of addiction was still very much a work in progress. The 1962 Kefauver-Harris Amendment, passed in the wake of the thalidomide disaster, significantly strengthened the FDA's authority to require evidence of both safety and efficacy before approving new drugs. This was a genuine turning point in American pharmaceutical regulation and a legitimate achievement of public health policy. It was also, in the case of amphetamine, applied to a drug that had already been commercially available for nearly 30 years and was already deeply embedded in American medical practice, which meant that the regulatory tightening came to a landscape that had been shaped by 3 decades of relatively unrestricted use. Removing something from the medicine cabinet is considerably harder than preventing it from getting there in the first place. The FDA's approach to amphetamine throughout the 1950s and 60s was shaped by a genuine tension between 2 legitimate concerns: the evidence that the drugs were being misused and producing harm in some populations, and the evidence that they were providing real benefit to other populations in contexts ranging from ADHD treatment to narcolepsy management to military fatigue suppression. The agency was also operating in a political environment in which the pharmaceutical industry was a powerful lobbying force, and in which the concept of restricting medications that physicians considered useful was not without controversy. The balance it struck was imperfect, as balances under those conditions tend to be, and it produced a regulatory history that is easier to criticize in retrospect than it would have been to navigate in real time. What is clear is that the FDA's response to amphetamine was consistently reactive rather than anticipatory. The agency tightened restrictions when problems became undeniable, loosened them when medical applications were compelling, and repeatedly found itself a step behind a pharmaceutical market that was moving faster and a public demand that was more persistent than any individual regulatory intervention could fully address. This pattern, problem identified, restriction imposed, market adapts, new problem emerges, would play out repeatedly over the following decades, each iteration involving a slightly different drug, a slightly different population, and a regulatory response that was calibrated to the previous crisis rather than the developing one. By the late 1950s and into the 60s, amphetamine had thoroughly embedded itself in the world of performance, athletic, artistic, and otherwise. Elvis Presley, who would later become one of the most famous cautionary tales in American pharmaceutical history, was introduced to amphetamines during his time in the army, and continued using them for the rest of his life in quantities that his physicians, to their considerable discredit, helped supply. Olympic athletes in the 1952 Helsinki Games were observed collapsing at the finish line of cycling events, not from exhaustion alone, but from the combined effects of amphetamine and extreme physical exertion. The International Olympic Committee did not begin testing for stimulants until 1968, by which point the practice was so widespread that the testing results, when they came, surprised almost no one involved in competitive sport. Football players took it, cyclists took it, swimmers took it. The idea that performance was something that could be chemically enhanced was not controversial in this era. It was simply how things were done. Elvis's case is worth pausing on, not because it is the most dramatic story in the history of performance and stimulants, but because it is one of the most thoroughly documented and what it documents is the way in which pharmaceutical access and celebrity intersected in mid-century America to produce a kind of medically supervised self-destruction. His first exposure to amphetamines came in the army, where the tablets were available to soldiers and where the culture around them was relaxed enough that a young man from Tupelo, Mississippi, would have encountered them without much occasion for alarm. When he returned to civilian life and to the demands of a performance schedule that would have exhausted a person half his age, he found physicians who were willing to prescribe what he needed to maintain it. This is not a story about a weak person making bad choices. It is a story about a system that made those choices very easy. The athletic world's relationship with amphetamine in the 1950s and early 60s was even more straightforward, because the goals were more concrete and the measurement was more precise. You either ran faster or you did not. You either stayed on the bicycle or you fell off. The amphetamine helped with the first of these things, and at sufficiently high doses or over sufficiently extended periods contributed to the second. The deaths that occurred in competitive cycling in the 1960s, Tom Simpson's collapse on Mont Ventoux during the Tour de France in 1967 being the most famous, brought the issue to public attention in a way that could not easily be managed. Simpson died with amphetamines in his bloodstream and in his jersey pocket on one of the most televised sporting stages in the world. The IOC's decision to begin drug testing the following year was not coincidental. What these stories share is a common structure, a performance demand, a drug that addresses it, an escalating dependency, and an eventual collapse that the people around the performer saw coming long before it arrived and did not, for various reasons, act to prevent. The reasons vary by case: money, loyalty, medical ethics, simple denial, but the structure repeats with the consistency of a cautionary tale that nobody involved seems to have actually read. The 1960s brought amphetamine into the highest levels of American government, and it did so through the person of Dr. Max Jacobson, a New York physician nicknamed Miracle Max by his celebrity clientele, who was administering amphetamine injections to an impressive roster of patients that included, at various points, politicians, artists, and the President of the United States. John F. Kennedy received injections from Dr. Jacobson both before and during the Vienna summit with Nikita Khrushchev in 1961, one of the most consequential diplomatic meetings of the Cold War era. Kennedy's aides were uncomfortable with the arrangement. Kennedy was reportedly not particularly interested in their discomfort. Whether the amphetamine improved or impaired his performance at the summit is a question historians have debated with various degrees of confidence, and none of the certainty that any of them would prefer. Max Jacobson was a genuine character in the specifically mid-century New York sense, a German Jewish émigré with real medical training, a magnetic personal style, and a practice that had somehow assembled an extraordinary client list including Truman, Capote, Marlene Dietrich, Cecil B. DeMille, Tennessee Williams, and eventually the First Family. His injections contained amphetamine along with various other compounds, vitamins, steroids, sometimes animal cells, in a combination that he described as therapeutic, and that his patients described as making them feel extraordinarily well. He was not secretive about the amphetamine component, but he was not advertising it either. His approach was to produce results and let the results do the persuading, which they did, apparently effectively, for a remarkably long time. The Vienna summit in June of 1961 is worth understanding as a context for what was being asked of a president managing significant health problems with Jacobson's assistance. Kennedy had Addison's disease, chronic back pain, and a collection of other conditions that were being managed with a pharmaceutical regimen complex, enough to require careful coordination even without the amphetamine injections. He was meeting the leader of the Soviet Union for the first time in a diplomatic encounter that historians have generally characterized as not going well for the American side. Khrushchev later claimed that Kennedy seemed weak and uncertain, an impression that emboldened him in subsequent months. Whether this was related to the amphetamine, to Kennedy's underlying health problems, to the geopolitical situation, or to Khrushchev's own interested interpretation of events, is not something the historical record resolves cleanly. Jacobson's medical license was eventually revoked in 1975 after an investigation found that he had been dispensing controlled substances without adequate patient records and with a carelessness about dosing that the medical board found difficult to defend. By that point, Kennedy had been dead for more than a decade. The story of Miracle Max and his famous patients became public gradually, through memoirs and investigative journalism, and it produced in retrospect an unsettling picture of how thoroughly amphetamine had infiltrated the performance demands of mid-century American life, not just in truck stops and dormitories, but in the offices where the decisions were made. By the mid-1960s, the American counterculture had developed a complicated internal debate about amphetamine that was both philosophical and practical. The psychedelic wing of the movement, the LSD advocates, the Grateful Dead contingent, the Timothy Leary followers, tended to view amphetamine with suspicion bordering on contempt. Speed, as it was now universally called, produced a kind of hard-edged, aggressive, teeth-grinding energy that sat uneasily alongside the expansive, universe-dissolving experiences that psychedelics promised. The famous Haight-Ashbury slogan "Speed Kills" was not a government public health campaign. It originated within the counterculture itself, as an attempt by the psychedelic community to draw a distinction between the drugs they endorsed and the ones they found corrosive. The amphetamine users of the Haight, the people who had been awake for 4 days and were visibly unwell, were, by this account, doing it wrong. The distinction the counterculture was drawing was not merely pharmacological, it was also moral and aesthetic. LSD, in the framework of the psychedelic movement, was a consciousness-expanding drug. It dissolved ego, revealed interconnection, and produced states of profound, if temporary, wisdom. Amphetamine, in the same framework, was a consciousness-contracting drug. It narrowed attention, amplified ego, produced grandiosity rather than humility, and left users in worse shape than it found them. Whether this distinction held up to scrutiny depended considerably on how honest you were being about the psychedelics, which had their own complicated relationship with delusion and ego inflation. But as a cultural narrative, it was compelling and it spread. The Haight-Ashbury Free Clinic, which opened in 1967 to provide medical care to the neighbourhood's increasingly large and increasingly unwell population of young people, saw firsthand what the speed community looked like after extended use. The psychedelic users presented with their own suite of problems: bad trips, paranoia, disorientation. But the methamphetamine users presented with something that the clinic's physicians found more systematically alarming: severe malnutrition, dental deterioration, cardiovascular stress, and a psychological state that combined grandiose certainty with explosive irritability in combinations that were difficult to manage in a medical setting that was already stretched. The clinic staff became vocal advocates for the Speed Kills message, which gave it a medical credibility it would not have carried if it had originated purely in hippie ideology. What the 1960s counterculture established, through its internal debate about amphetamine, was a distinction between kinds of drug use that would persist in American cultural life for decades, a hierarchy in which some substances were associated with expansion and insight, and others with constriction and decay. This hierarchy did not map cleanly onto pharmacology or onto the actual experiences of the people using the drugs, but it shaped how the culture talked about stimulants, and it created a framework in which crystal methamphetamine, when it arrived in force in the 1980s and 90s, could be positioned as categorically different from and more dangerous than the amphetamines that were, simultaneously, being prescribed to children in paediatricians' offices across the country. Methamphetamine is not a new drug. It was synthesized in Japan in 1919, used extensively by Japanese military and civilian populations during the Second World War, and available as an over-the-counter stimulant in Japan well into the post-war period. In the United States, it was legally manufactured and prescribed under brand names including Desoxin and Methedrin for conditions ranging from obesity to depression to nasal congestion. What changed in the 1960s and 70s was not the drug but the context around it. The shift from pharmaceutical production to illicit manufacture, the move from middle-class medicine cabinets to biker gang territories, and the gradual consolidation of methamphetamine's reputation as something categorically different from and more dangerous than the amphetamines that American physicians had been distributing so freely for the previous 30 years. The distinction was, chemically speaking, somewhat less dramatic than its cultural weight suggested. The biker gangs of California, the Hells Angels most prominently, played a specific and historically documented role in the development of illicit methamphetamine production and distribution in the 1960s and 70s. They were not the only actors, but they were early ones, and they established a production model, small-scale synthesis using commercially available precursor chemicals, distribution through tight social networks that would persist and eventually be superseded by far larger and more sophisticated operations. The Hells Angels were not chemists in any formal sense. They were people who had learned, by trial and considerable error, how to synthesize a compound that their customers wanted and that the pharmaceutical industry was no longer providing as freely as it once had. The regulatory tightening of the late 60s had created a supply gap. The biker labs filled it. The methamphetamine produced in these early illicit operations was not identical to the pharmaceutical product, and the difference was not merely symbolic. Precursor chemicals of variable quality, synthesis processes of variable precision, and product of variable purity produced a drug that was more unpredictable in its effects and more dangerous in its contaminants than the Desoxin tablets a physician might have prescribed a decade earlier. This variability was one of the features of illicit drug production that pharmaceutical regulation was originally designed to address, and its reappearance in the methamphetamine market illustrated with unfortunate clarity what happened when that regulation was circumvented. By the early 1980s, methamphetamine had established itself as a significant illicit drug in specific regional markets: California, the Pacific Northwest, parts of the rural South, while remaining largely invisible in the national drug conversation, which was focused primarily on heroin, cocaine, and the emerging crack epidemic. The invisibility was partly geographic and partly demographic. Methamphetamine was associated with working-class white communities in ways that cocaine was not, and the drug policy apparatus of the era was more attentive to urban drug markets than rural ones. This invisibility would not last. The conditions for a national crisis were assembling themselves slowly in the trailer parks and small towns of a country that was about to discover what happened when a powerful stimulant met communities that had run out of better options. In 1970, President Richard Nixon signed the Controlled Substances Act into law, and for the first time the United States had a formal federal framework for categorizing drugs according to their potential for abuse and accepted medical use. Amphetamines were placed in Schedule 2, high potential for abuse, but with accepted medical applications, alongside cocaine and methamphetamine. It was a classification that acknowledged both the drug's dangers and the pharmaceutical industry's continued interest in selling it. The Controlled Substances Act was the opening move in what Nixon would formally declare a year later as a war on drugs, a framing that would shape American drug policy for the next 5 decades, prioritizing criminal enforcement over public health and producing consequences that historians are still very carefully trying to measure. John Ehrlichman, Nixon's domestic policy chief, gave an interview in 1994 that was published after his death and has since become one of the most cited documents in the history of American drug policy. In it, he described the war on drugs as having been designed not to address the public health problems associated with drug use, but to disrupt and criminalize the two political constituencies that Nixon considered enemies, the anti-war left and black Americans. "We knew we couldn't make it illegal to be either against the war or black," Ehrlichman said, but by getting the public to associate the hippies with marijuana and blacks with heroin, and then criminalizing both heavily, we could disrupt those communities. This account has been disputed in its specifics by some historians and accepted by others. What is not disputed is that the war on drugs, as it was actually implemented, produced incarceration rates that fell disproportionately on black and Latino communities, despite drug use rates that were not significantly different across racial groups. Amphetamines schedule. Two status created a specific set of conditions that shaped its subsequent history in ways that were not fully anticipated at the time. The scheduling acknowledged medical utility, which meant that pharmaceutical production could continue, and physician prescription was legal. It imposed controls on production quantity and prescription practices, which created compliance costs for the pharmaceutical industry, but did not shut down the market. And it established methamphetamine as a controlled substance in a framework that would eventually support prosecution of illicit producers and distributors, which it did, extensively and expensively, without eliminating either the supply or the demand. The 1970s were, for prescription amphetamines, a period of consolidation and contraction. Prescriptions for diet pills declined as the FDA tightened restrictions on amphetamine-based weight loss medications. The pharmaceutical industry pivoted toward developing new stimulant compounds that were outside the Schedule II framework, Ritalin, which became the dominant pediatric stimulant of the 1980s, is a methylphenidate compound, not an amphetamine, and was initially subject to less regulatory scrutiny. The war on drugs focused its enforcement attention primarily on heroin and eventually cocaine. Amphetamine was present, controlled, and waiting for the next chapter in its story, which arrived in the 1990s with the consolidation of ADHD as a diagnostic category and the return of amphetamine-based medications as first-line treatments. Somewhere in the middle of 100 years of use, marketing, legislation, and cultural debate, it is worth pausing to ask what amphetamine actually does, not to the culture or to the pharmaceutical market, but to the brain. The mechanism is, in its basics, relatively well understood. Amphetamine increases the release of dopamine and norepinephrine in the brain, flooding the synaptic gap with neurotransmitters that are associated with attention, motivation, wakefulness, and pleasure. In someone whose dopamine regulation is functioning in the typical range, this produces the focused, energized, appetite-suppressed state that users describe as being on. In someone whose dopamine system is underactive, as is believed to be the case in ADHD, the same medication produces a paradoxically normalizing effect. The flood of dopamine brings the system up to a baseline that makes sustained attention possible in a way it previously was not. The observation that stimulants had this paradoxically calming effect on children who struggled with hyperactivity and attention had been noted as early as 1937, when a physician named Charles Bradley gave Benzedrine to behaviourally difficult children at a Rhode Island hospital and observed that many of them became dramatically easier to manage and better able to focus on schoolwork. Bradley's findings were noted, then largely ignored for several decades. The rediscovery of Bradley's work and the gradual construction of ADHD as a formal diagnostic category through the 1970s and 80s, happened in the context of a growing body of neurological research that was beginning to map the specific brain differences associated with attention and impulse control difficulties. Brain imaging technology was improving, the understanding of dopaminergic systems was advancing, and the clinical presentation of ADHD, the chronic inattention, the impulsivity, the difficulty with executive function was being distinguished with increasing precision from behavioral problems of other etiologies. The diagnosis was real. The question of how broadly it should be applied and to whom was considerably more contested. By the time ADHD was established as the most commonly diagnosed neurodevelopmental condition in American children, the pharmaceutical industry had recognized what was effectively a new and enormous market for stimulant medications. Ritalin, the methylphenidate compound, had been the dominant treatment through the 1980s. But as the 90s arrived and the ADHD diagnosis expanded, both in terms of the number of children being diagnosed and the recognition that the condition persisted into adulthood, the pharmaceutical industry began investing in new amphetamine-based formulations, better tolerated, longer acting, more precisely dosed than the compounds that had been available in the 1950s. The investment was strategic and the timing was well chosen. The diagnostic category was growing. The insurance coverage was expanding. The pediatric market was large, and the adult market was potentially larger. What Bradley's 1937 paper could not have anticipated, and what the researchers who rediscovered it in the 1980s were also not fully positioned to anticipate, was the scale at which the diagnosis would eventually be applied. The identification of ADHD as a condition that responded to stimulant treatment was scientifically legitimate. What happened in the 3 decades that followed, the rate at which the diagnosis expanded, the geographic and demographic variations in prescription rates, the commercial pressures on the diagnostic process, is a considerably more complicated story, and one that has not yet reached its ending. The drug that would become the most prescribed amphetamine in American history did not arrive with fanfare or a dramatic scientific breakthrough. It arrived in 1996 as a rebranding. Obertrol, an amphetamine mixture originally developed as a diet pill in the 1960s, was reformulated, renamed and introduced to the market as Adderall, a compound specifically for the treatment of attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. The name itself was a deliberate marketing choice, derived from the phrase ADD for all. The drug was not new. The active ingredients were not new. The ratio of amphetamine salts was adjusted, the packaging was updated, and the target population shifted from overweight housewives seeking appetite suppression to children and adults struggling with focus and impulse control. The transition was smooth, lucrative, and, depending on your perspective, either a triumph of pharmaceutical innovation or a masterclass in product repositioning. Richwood Pharmaceuticals, the company that introduced Adderall, had acquired the rights to Obertrol when the original manufacturer lost its FDA approval for the diet drug indication. The company recognized that the underlying compound, a mixture of amphetamine salts including both amphetamine and dextroamphetamine, was pharmacologically sound, and that the existing ADHD medication market dominated by Ritalin had room for a competitor. The reformulation was genuine. The specific salt composition was adjusted to optimize the duration and quality of the stimulant effect for the ADHD use case. But the core molecule was the same one that had been suppressing the appetites of American women since the 1960s, which is the kind of pharmaceutical history that tends to get glossed over in the marketing materials. The timing of Adderall's introduction could not have been better calibrated for commercial success. The ADHD diagnosis was expanding rapidly through the mid-90s. The limitations of Ritalin, its relatively short duration of action, the stigma associated with taking medication at school in front of peers, the twice-daily dosing schedule had produced a parent population that was receptive to alternatives. Adderall's initial formulation had a longer effective window than standard-release Ritalin, which meant that some children could take a single morning dose and remain covered through the school day without a midday visit to the nurse's office. This was a real clinical advantage, and physicians responded to it. By the late 1990s, Adderall had established itself as a significant player in the ADHD medication market. The extended-release formulation, Adderall XR, introduced in 2001, consolidated that position. The XR capsule, small, distinctive, containing beads that released the medication in 2 phases over approximately 12 hours, became one of the most recognizable pharmaceutical products in American life. It was in the backpacks of elementary school students and the briefcases of corporate executives. It was the subject of college application essays and late-night talk show monologues. It was, for a particular generation of Americans, simply the medication. The thing you took in the morning the way your parents took a multivitamin, except that it cost significantly more and required a controlled substance prescription and periodic DEA quota adjustments. The 1990s were very good for amphetamine. ADHD diagnoses in American children rose sharply throughout the decade, driven by a combination of factors that included genuinely improved diagnostic criteria, greater awareness among parents and teachers, aggressive pharmaceutical marketing to physicians, and a cultural moment in which productivity and performance had taken on an almost religious significance. Ritalin, a non-amphetamine stimulant, had dominated the pediatric market through the 80s. But as Adderall entered and amphetamine-based medications were refined and extended-release formulations were developed, the market diversified rapidly. By the end of the decade, millions of American children were taking prescription stimulants, and the political and medical debate about whether this represented appropriate treatment or industrial-scale pharmaceutical experimentation on the developing brain was just beginning to find its volume. The cultural context of the 90s matters for understanding the prescription boom because it provides the backdrop against which the expansion of ADHD diagnosis made sense to the people participating in it. American schools were under increasing pressure to produce measurable academic outcomes. The standards-based education movement, which culminated in the early 2000s with No Child Left Behind, was already generating the test score culture that would define American education for the following 2 decades. In this environment, a child who was struggling to sit still and complete assignments was not just a problem for that child and that family, they were a problem for the school's metrics. The incentives for identifying and treating the condition were not exclusively pharmaceutical. They were institutional. Parents who pursued ADHD diagnoses for their children in the 1990s were, for the most part, acting in good faith and responding to genuine observations about their children's behavior. The children who received those diagnoses and were prescribed stimulant medications were not for the most part misidentified or mistreated. The condition is real. The medications help the people who have it. What happened at the margins of this largely defensible core was a gradual expansion of the diagnostic category, driven by a combination of legitimate scientific broadening, commercial pressure, and the simple human tendency to reach for a solution. When a problem is visible and a solution is available, that produced prescription rates higher than any other country in the developed world, and that generated questions about whether some portion of the children being treated might have been adequately served by environmental adjustments rather than pharmacological ones. These questions were not comfortable ones, because they required distinguishing between the legitimate treatment of a neurodevelopmental condition and the pharmaceutical management of behavior that society found inconvenient, and that distinction is genuinely difficult to make in individual cases. The child who cannot sit still in a classroom designed for children who can sit still presents the same clinical picture regardless of whether the root cause is neurological difference or an environment poorly matched to their particular way of learning. The medication helps in both cases, which is both the strength of the treatment and the reason the diagnostic boundary is hard to enforce. By the time the late 90s turned into the early 2000s, a second wave of non-prescribed amphetamine use had established itself quietly and almost openly on American college campuses. The students taking Adderall without prescriptions during exam periods were not, by and large, the kind of people who thought of themselves as drug users. They were pre-med students and business majors, and people who needed to write 40 pages by Thursday morning and had run out of other options. The informal market for diverted prescription stimulants was not hidden. It operated in dormitory common rooms and library study spaces with a casualness that suggested no one involved had fully processed the regulatory status of what they were trading. The DEA was aware of the problem. University administrators were aware of the problem. The students were also technically aware that it was illegal, and mostly did not find this information particularly persuasive when a 15-page paper was due at 8 in the morning. The campus study drug culture of the early 2000s had a specific social texture that distinguished it from the recreational drug use with which it coexisted. Students who used Adderall non-prescriptively were not typically using it at parties. They were using it in the library at 2 in the morning, at the reference desk, at the carrel in the corner, with the good lighting and the outlet that worked. The context was relentlessly instrumental. You took it because you had something to finish and not enough time to finish it, and sleeping was not a currently available option. You did not take it because it was fun, although it was somewhat fun, and that was part of the problem, because the thing that made it easier to study also made it easier to want to study again next time under the same circumstances rather than planning better. The ethical debate about study drugs on college campuses, whether their use constituted cheating, whether they provided unfair advantages, whether universities should address them through policy or through treatment, ran through this period with considerable heat and relatively little resolution. The arguments in favour of treating cognitive enhancement as straightforwardly analogous to academic dishonesty tended to founder on the observation that caffeine, which was being consumed in industrial quantities in every campus coffee shop, also enhanced cognitive performance, and that the distinction between legal and illegal stimulants was doing a lot of the work in the ethical argument without necessarily being the most principled place to draw the line. What was not debated, because it was observable, was the distribution pattern. Students who could obtain prescriptions which required either a genuine ADHD diagnosis or access to a physician willing to provide one without extensive evaluation had legal, covered, reliable access to the medication. Students who could not obtain prescriptions either went without or purchased diverted pills from classmates at prices that varied by proximity to exam period. The structural inequity was obvious. The student who could afford a psychiatrist's evaluation and whose parents were comfortable navigating the mental health system had access to a performance tool that the student from a less well-resourced background did not. Whether this constituted an advantage worth addressing systematically was a question that most universities eventually decided to answer, primarily by prohibiting non-prescribed use and leaving the rest of the structure in place. While prescription amphetamines were expanding their reach through American medicine in the 90s, a parallel and much darker crisis was assembling itself in rural and working-class communities across the country. Crystal methamphetamine, smokable, cheap, and devastatingly potent, had been present in American drug culture since the 1980s, primarily in California and the Southwest. But through the 90s and into the early 2000s, it spread with a speed and geographic reach that caught law enforcement and public health officials genuinely off guard. Small-town America which had largely been insulated from the crack cocaine epidemic of the 80s, was not insulated from methamphetamine. The drug could be manufactured locally with ingredients available at farm supply stores and hardware shops, which meant that the supply chain was distributed and nearly impossible to dismantle through the traditional strategy of targeting trafficking routes. The communities in which crystal methamphetamine took hold in the 1990s shared certain characteristics that are not difficult to identify in retrospect, though they were less clearly visible to the policymakers who were looking at them in real time. These were places where the economic transformations of the late 20th century, deindustrialization, the decline of agricultural employment, the consolidation of retail into large chains that reduced the density of local economic activity, had produced sustained unemployment and the specific kind of despair that comes from watching an economy reorganize itself in ways that leave your particular skills and your particular place behind. Crystal methamphetamine addressed some of the symptoms of that despair with a directness and an efficiency that nothing legal and affordable was offering. It produced energy, confidence, a reduction in appetite that helped when food was expensive, and a sociability that temporarily dissolved the isolation. It also destroyed teeth, caused psychosis, and created dependencies that compressed lifespans in ways that were visible and devastating in communities small enough that everyone knew each other. The public health response to the crystal meth crisis was slower and less resourced than the response to the crack cocaine epidemic had been, and the disparity was not lost on observers who noted the demographic differences between the two affected populations. Crack had been an urban crisis, concentrated in communities of colour, and had produced a swift and severe law enforcement response. Crystal meth was a rural and suburban crisis, concentrated in white communities, and produced a response that was more mixed, some enforcement, some public health messaging, some treatment funding, and that arrived more gradually. The political symbolism of the two crises was different in ways that shaped the policy, responses, and those differences are part of the history. In 2005, the United States Congress passed the Combat Methamphetamine Epidemic Act, which moved pseudoephedrine, a decongestant used in common cold medications, and also a key precursor chemical for methamphetamine production, behind the pharmacy counter, required purchasers to show identification and imposed daily and monthly purchasing limits. It was a genuinely unusual piece of legislation, a federal law that made buying Sudafed require more documentation than buying a handgun in many states. The law's effect on domestic meth production was measurable and real. Small-scale home production dropped sharply. And then, with the adaptability that has characterized methamphetamine trafficking at every stage of its history, the supply chain reorganized. Production shifted to large-scale operations in Mexico, and the drug continued to flow north across the border in quantities that had not diminished by the time the law's first decade passed. The pseudoephedrine restrictions produced an unintended consequence in the cold medicine aisle that is now so familiar it has become unremarkable. The requirement to show identification and sign a logbook to purchase what is, by any reasonable assessment, a mild decongestant that the majority of purchasers are buying because they have a cold. The pharmacist who asks to see your driver's license before selling you Claritin D is operating within a regulatory framework that was designed to prevent methamphetamine production, and that succeeds, partially, at that goal, while also treating every person with seasonal allergies as a potential drug manufacturer until proven otherwise. This is, depending on your disposition, either an acceptable cost of public health policy or a small daily reminder that drug laws produce their own inconveniences. Oregon and Mississippi experimented at various points with requiring prescriptions for pseudoephedrine entirely, eliminating the over-the-counter market for the drug in those states. The effect on meth availability was limited, because the supply had long since shifted to imported product rather than domestic production. The effect on the ability of people with colds to access decongestants without visiting a physician was immediate and concrete. Oregon eventually reversed the prescription requirement after a period of evaluation. The broader lesson that supply-side interventions in drug markets tend to be displaced by supply chain adaptation rather than eliminated was not new, but it was reinforced. The methamphetamine that flooded into the United States from Mexico after the domestic production decline was, by most accounts, purer and cheaper than what the home labs had been producing. The enforcement intervention had not reduced availability. It had consolidated production into a more efficient and more difficult to disrupt supply chain, lowered the price and raised the purity, which is the opposite of what supply-side drug policy interventions are designed to produce. The situation in the early 2010s, with Mexican cartel-produced crystal methamphetamine available at lower prices and higher potencies than ever before in communities across the country, was a crystallization, if you will excuse the word, of the limits of enforcement-focused approaches to an addiction crisis. The American military's relationship with amphetamines did not end with the Second World War. It continued, with varying degrees of official acknowledgement, through Korea, Vietnam, the Gulf War, and into the post-September 11th conflicts in Afghanistan and Iraq. Air Force pilots flying long combat missions were issued dextroamphetamine tablets, officially called Go pills, as part of a fatigue management program that was acknowledged, regulated, and defended by military medical authorities as a legitimate safety measure. The program attracted significant attention in 2002, when 2 Canadian soldiers on a nighttime exercise in Afghanistan were killed by a bomb dropped from an American F-16 whose pilot had taken Go pills before the flight. The subsequent investigation raised questions about whether the amphetamine contributed to the pilot's decision-making that have never been entirely resolved. The Tarnack Farm incident, as it became known, is worth understanding in some detail because it illustrates the specific dilemma that military amphetamine use creates, a dilemma that is not neatly resolvable by either prohibiting the drugs or continuing to use them without acknowledgement. The 2 F-16 pilots who dropped the bomb that killed 4 Canadian soldiers had been on a mission lasting approximately 9 hours, at the end of a day that had begun well before the mission. They had taken dextroamphetamine in accordance with Air Force regulations. They misidentified ground fire from the Canadian unit's nighttime training exercise as hostile. They made a decision to attack and then failed to make use of procedures that might have prevented the attack. The Canadian government requested access to the pilot's medical records and flight logs. The American military initially resisted. The subsequent inquiry found that the pilots had acted incorrectly, but concluded that criminal charges were not warranted. The pilots received administrative punishments. The Go Pill program received scrutiny. The Air Force's defense of the program rested on a logic that is genuinely defensible in its core components: that fatigue is a significant contributor to aviation accidents and to poor decision-making in combat, that dextroamphetamine effectively addresses fatigue-related performance degradation, and that the risks associated with a fatigued pilot making a poor decision under combat conditions were potentially greater than the risks associated with an amphetamine using pilot making a poor decision under combat conditions. This is not a frivolous argument. Aviation is an unforgiving environment, and fatigue-related accidents are real and fatal. The question is whether the drug's effect on risk perception and impulse control, which is not the same as its effect on physical alertness, might, under specific circumstances, contribute to the kind of confident, rapid decision-making that produces a bomb on a training exercise. The program continued, with updated guidelines and dosing protocols after the Tarnack Farm investigation. Go pills are still available to American military pilots under regulated conditions. The tension between their genuine utility and their genuine risks has not been resolved, because it cannot be resolved by policy alone. It can only be managed, which is what the military has continued to do. To understand why the United States consumes a dramatically disproportionate share of the world's prescription amphetamines, roughly 80 to 90% of the global supply at various points, it is necessary to understand the pharmaceutical marketing apparatus that grew up alongside the expanding ADHD diagnosis through the 90s and 2000s. Pharmaceutical companies were, for a period, permitted to market directly to consumers in television advertising, and the ADHD medication category became one of the most aggressively marketed in American medicine. Physicians received extensive outreach from pharmaceutical sales representatives, patient advocacy groups, some of which received funding from pharmaceutical companies, promoted awareness of ADHD and the availability of medication. Diagnostic criteria were debated, adjusted, and in some critics' view, deliberately broadened to expand the market. Whether this represented appropriate treatment reaching a previously underserved population or pharmaceutical industry capture of a diagnostic category is a question that serious researchers continue to argue about in peer-reviewed journals with a great deal of footnoting. Direct-to-consumer pharmaceutical advertising, which the FDA permitted in the United States in a limited form from 1985 and in a more expansive form from 1997, created a specific dynamic in the ADHD medication market. Parents watching television began to encounter advertisements that described ADHD symptoms in terms that were recognizable from their own children's behavior, and that presented medication as a straightforward solution to the problem. The advertisements were not presenting false information. The symptoms described were real. The medication worked for the children who had the condition. What the advertisements were not equipped to communicate was the complexity of diagnosis. The fact that the symptoms of ADHD overlap with the symptoms of anxiety, depression, sleep disorders, learning disabilities, and the entirely normal behavioral range of children who are bored, understimulated, stressed, or simply 6 years old. The pharmaceutical sales representative system, which placed company employees in physician offices across the country and provided samples, educational materials, and various forms of professional hospitality in exchange for prescribing patterns, created a second channel through which the ADHD medication market expanded. Physicians who prescribed amphetamine-based medications received more attention from pharmaceutical companies than physicians who did not, which is not a neutral fact. The relationship between the pharmaceutical industry's promotional activities and the prescription rates that followed has been studied extensively, and the findings consistently show a correlation that the industry disputes and independent researchers find difficult to attribute to coincidence. The global comparison is striking and requires explanation. The United States prescribes ADHD medications at rates multiple times higher than any other developed country. The neurological basis of ADHD does not vary dramatically across national populations. The diagnostic criteria, derived from the American Psychiatric Association's Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, are used internationally. What varies is the rate at which the diagnosis is applied and the rate at which medication is the primary response when it is. This variation reflects differences in healthcare systems, in cultural attitudes toward medication, in regulatory environments, and in the scale of pharmaceutical marketing activity. The United States scores high on all of the variables that predict high prescription rates. The result is a prescription pattern that is genuinely difficult to explain on clinical grounds alone. For most of the early history of ADHD as a diagnostic category, it was understood as a childhood condition, something that children experienced, struggled with, and in the conventional wisdom of the 1970s and 80s, largely outgrew by adolescence. The realization that this was not in fact true, that ADHD persisted into, adulthood for a substantial proportion of those diagnosed in childhood, and that a significant number of adults who had never been diagnosed as children were experiencing the same difficulties with attention, impulse control, and executive function, was both a genuine scientific finding and an event of considerable commercial significance. The adult ADHD market was, from the pharmaceutical industry's perspective, very large. The medications used to treat it were, by definition, the same ones that had been treating children for decades. The result was a rapid expansion in adult prescriptions through the 2000s and into the 2010s that added millions of new patients to the amphetamine-consuming population. The science of adult ADHD is real, and the clinical need is real, and these facts deserve emphasis before the commercial dimensions are discussed, because the commercial dimensions can make it easy to lose sight of the human ones. Adults with undiagnosed ADHD have, research, consistently shows significantly higher rates of job instability, relationship difficulty, financial problems, accidental injury, and substance use than adults without the condition. Many of them spent their entire childhoods and young adult years being told they were lazy, careless, undisciplined, or not trying hard enough. The diagnosis, when it came, was for many of them genuinely clarifying, a framework that explained a lifetime of experiences in a way that reassigned the cause from character deficiency to neurological difference. The medication, when it worked, was transformative in ways that were not subtle or marginal, but fundamental to daily functioning. This is the core of the adult ADHD story, and it is true. What is also true is that the criteria for adult ADHD, and the way those criteria were applied in clinical practice, were subject to the same commercial pressures and diagnostic drift that had expanded the childhood diagnosis in the previous decade. Adults who were struggling with work demands, with relationship stress, with the cognitive load of modern life, were presenting to physicians and psychiatrists with complaints that overlapped with ADHD symptoms and that were, in some cases, better explained by anxiety, depression, burnout, or the simple mathematics of trying to do more than is humanly possible without adequate sleep or support. The stimulants helped in all these cases because stimulants help most people function better in the short term regardless of their underlying condition. Distinguishing between the adult with ADHD and the adult who's overwhelmed and tired is genuinely difficult, and the incentive structure of American healthcare does not consistently reward the time required to make the distinction carefully. The prescription rates for adult ADHD medications tell a story that is difficult to interpret without ambivalence. Between 2000 and 2020, adult prescriptions for amphetamine-based ADHD medications increased by several 100% in the United States. Some of this increase represents appropriate treatment reaching people who needed it. Some of it represents diagnostic expansion into territory where the clinical evidence is thinner. The proportion of each is impossible to determine precisely, which is itself part of the problem. In 2022 and 2023, something happened that had not happened in the modern era of ADHD medication. The United States ran out. A combination of factors, manufacturing delays, DEA production quotas that had not kept pace with demand, pandemic-era disruptions to pharmaceutical supply chains, and a sharp increase in prescriptions driven partly by telehealth services that had expanded dramatically during the lockdowns, converged to produce a nationwide shortage of Adderall and other amphetamine-based medications. Pharmacies were rationing supplies. Patients with long-standing prescriptions were calling dozens of pharmacies in search of a filled bottle. Children who had been stable on their medications for years were abruptly unable to access them. The shortage was a strange and clarifying moment. It made visible, very suddenly, just how many millions of Americans had become dependent, in the entirely legitimate clinical sense, on a daily supply of amphetamine to function. Not dependent in the sense of craving or compulsion, but dependent in the same way that you depend on blood pressure medication or thyroid hormone. The kind of dependent the word was never meant to stigmatize, but frequently does anyway. The DEA's production quota system is a feature of the Controlled Substances Act that most people who take prescription amphetamines are not aware of until it directly affects them, at which point they become aware of it very quickly and with considerable frustration. The DEA sets annual limits on the quantity of each controlled substance that can be manufactured in the United States, with the stated goal of preventing overproduction that might feed illicit markets. The logic is not unreasonable, but the quota system requires accurate forecasting of demand, and demand for amphetamine-based ADHD medications had been growing at a rate the system had not adequately tracked. The quota had been calibrated to historical prescription levels and had not been meaningfully adjusted to account for the rapid expansion through the telehealth boom of 2020 and 2021, during which hundreds of thousands of new patients, many of them adults who had genuinely been struggling for years without a diagnosis, began taking medication for the first time. When manufacturers reached their annual production limits and could not legally produce more without a quota increase, the shortage that had been quietly developing for months became acute. The pipeline simply stopped moving. The mechanics of running out of a controlled substance are different from running out of an over-the-counter medication, and they are worse. You cannot simply order more. The manufacturer cannot simply make more. The quota process involves regulatory filings and agency review, measured in months rather than days. Pharmacies could not predict which shipments would arrive or when. The software systems managing controlled substance inventory were not designed for the kind of regional and temporal variation the shortage produced, which meant patients calling ahead were navigating a system giving them outdated information, sending them on long drives to pharmacies that had sold their last units the previous afternoon. Some patients described calling 30 or 40 locations across multiple counties before finding a single one that could fill a 30-day supply. This is not a metaphor for bureaucratic inconvenience. It is a description of what actually happened to millions of people over more than a year. The experience of the shortage was not uniform, and the variation was not random. People with established pharmacy relationships, dense urban coverage, flexible work schedules, and the time to make dozens of phone calls on a Tuesday morning navigated the disruption with difficulty but ultimately successfully. They found their medication, even if that meant going without for a week or two while they searched. People without those advantages experienced something considerably harder. Patients in rural areas with 2 or 3 pharmacy options within reasonable driving distance found those options exhausted simultaneously. Patients whose employers could not accommodate extended pharmacy hunting went without because they could not take 4 hours from a workday to solve the problem. Patients without reliable transportation could not drive to the next county to find available stock. The shortage was inequitably distributed in the way that medical resource shortages in the United States reliably tend to be, along the lines of existing inequality with the people who most needed structural support to navigate it, having the least of it available. The resolution, gradual, imperfect, extending into 2024 in some markets, produced no fundamental policy change to the quota system or to the dynamics that had created the problem. The quotas were adjusted upward. Manufacturing capacity ramped back up. Telehealth prescriptions continued under somewhat stricter scrutiny following federal investigations. The structural tension between a drug the federal government classifies as high risk for abuse and a drug that tens of millions of Americans take every morning as a medically necessary part of daily functioning was acknowledged in policy discussions and not addressed in any of them. It continues to produce friction in the gap between what the regulatory system was designed to manage and what the medical reality has become. The next shortage will begin assembling itself as soon as demand grows faster than the quota system adjusts, which, History suggests it will. The system was not designed for this scale of need, and nobody has proposed a redesign that has a realistic path to becoming law. The COVID-19 pandemic changed American healthcare in ways that were immediately visible. Emptied waiting rooms, masked physicians behind plexiglass, the suspension of elective procedures, and in ways that were less immediately visible, but turned out to be more durable. One of the less discussed transformations was the rapid normalization of remote psychiatric evaluation and prescription, and specifically the rapid normalization of remote ADHD evaluation. As in-person medical appointments became difficult or impossible during the spring of 2020, telehealth companies expanded aggressively into mental health services, and several of them, most prominently a company called Dun and another called Cerebral, built business models centered specifically on ADHD diagnosis and medication management conducted entirely through video appointments, online questionnaires, and subscription-based care plans. The convenience was real. The access it created for patients who had genuinely been underserved was real. The speed with which it became possible to receive an ADHD diagnosis and a stimulant prescription without leaving your house was also real, and it was that speed and the business incentives that produced it that eventually attracted federal attention. The basic value proposition of telehealth ADHD services was not dishonest on its face, and it is worth understanding why before examining what went wrong at the margins. Access to ADHD evaluation in the United States had been, before the pandemic, distributed in ways that reflected the broader geography of American mental health care, which is to say unequally, and in patterns that tracked existing resource disparities closely. Rural areas had fewer psychiatrists and psychologists per capita than urban ones, dramatically fewer in some regions. The wait for a first appointment with a specialist who could conduct a comprehensive ADHD evaluation could be months in many markets, and some markets did not have that specialist at all within a reasonable driving distance. Adults who suspected they had ADHD and who were functioning adequately enough to not constitute a psychiatric emergency were not consistently prioritized by a mental health system that had more acute needs competing for the same limited capacity. Many of them had been managing, with varying degrees of success and at significant personal cost, for years or decades without any formal evaluation. The telehealth services offered faster access, geographic flexibility, and a lower barrier to beginning the process. For the patients who genuinely had the condition and had genuinely been unable to access care, this was a meaningful improvement in their lives, and the medication they received made a real difference. What emerged as a concern, first through journalistic investigation, then through patient complaints, then through federal scrutiny, was the specific business model pressure under which some of these companies were operating, and what that pressure produced in their clinical practices. The companies had been funded by venture capital investors who expected growth on timelines that were not calibrated to the deliberate pace of careful psychiatric evaluation. In a subscription-based model, growth meant more patients, and more patients meant more diagnoses, and more diagnoses meant more prescriptions, and more prescriptions meant more ongoing subscription revenue. The DEA, which regulates the prescribing of Schedule II controlled substances and had temporarily suspended certain in-person evaluation requirements during the pandemic as a public health accommodation, began receiving reports from pharmacists, physicians, and patients suggesting that some telehealth providers were writing prescriptions for amphetamines following evaluations that the agency found insufficient to support controlled substance prescribing. Evaluations conducted in 15 or 20 minutes via video, questionnaires that patients could complete in ways that reliably produced certain answers, clinical note templates that appeared to be populated with minimal individualized assessment. The picture that emerged was not of deliberate fraud across the board, but of a clinical culture in which the incentive structure consistently pushed toward diagnosis and prescription, rather than toward the kind of careful evaluation that a controlled substance prescription is supposed to require. The federal investigations that followed were directed not at telehealth as a concept, but at specific practices within specific companies, and they produced regulatory guidance that tightened the requirements for remote ADHD evaluation and prescription. Dunn and Cerebral both faced scrutiny, and both made changes to their practices in response. The DEA issued new rules governing telehealth prescribing of controlled substances. The emergency suspension of in-person evaluation requirements was allowed to expire, with some extended exceptions for established patient relationships. The regulatory pendulum swung back toward caution, producing its own set of access problems for patients in underserved areas who had benefited from the looser standards and who now found themselves again unable to reach care. The broader question, whether the telehealth expansion represented appropriate care reaching underserved populations or inappropriate prescribing driven by business incentives, or both simultaneously in proportions that cannot be cleanly separated, remains genuinely unresolved. The available data supports all three conclusions depending on which subset of patients and which subset of providers you examine. The patients who received accurate diagnoses and appropriate treatment through telehealth services during and after the pandemic are better off for having had access to them. The patients who received prescriptions following evaluations that were insufficient to support them are carrying risks, dependency, cardiovascular exposure, interactions with other medications that they may not have been adequately informed about and that they did not consent to in any meaningful sense. Distinguishing between these populations in the aggregate, let alone in individual cases, is the work that ongoing research and regulatory review are attempting. It is work that was not completed before the next chapter of the story began. If you tried to sketch a profile of the contemporary American amphetamine user, you would find that no single sketch is adequate. There are the children diagnosed in elementary school who are now adults in their 30s and 40s, who have taken stimulant medication every weekday morning for as long as they can remember, who have no real memory of mornings without it, who cannot tell you what their baseline feels like, because the medication has been part of the baseline since before they were old enough to question it. There are the college students with and without prescriptions for whom Adderall is as ordinary a study tool as a highlighter, passed across library tables with the casual generosity of people who do not think of themselves as participating in a controlled substance market. There are the middle-aged professionals who received an adult ADHD diagnosis at 42 and discovered, somewhat to their own surprise, that the medication reorganized their experience of daily life in ways that made the previous 4 decades feel like trying to read in a dark room. There are the people in rural communities living with the consequences of methamphetamine addiction, the dental damage, the cognitive deterioration, the specific kind of poverty that follows sustained dependency in a place where treatment is 3 counties away and the waiting list is 6 months long. And there are, at the edges of all of this, the people who are simply tired from overwork, from inadequate sleep, from the specific modern exhaustion of being expected to be productive, responsive, creative, emotionally available, and physically presentable all at the same time, who have found that a stimulant makes the impossible merely difficult. None of these people are the same. All of them are taking amphetamine. The scale of legal amphetamine use in the United States is large enough that it defies easy intuition. At various points in the last decade, prescription data has shown that somewhere between 16 and 20 million Americans have active prescriptions for amphetamine-based medications, a number representing roughly 6% of the entire population, 6% of the country. That is more people than live in the state of Georgia, all of them picking up a Schedule II controlled substance at the pharmacy counter on a recurring basis, most of them because a physician determined it was medically appropriate, and most of them, by the available evidence, functioning better for having done so. The demographic breakdown has shifted considerably over time. Early ADHD treatment was predominantly male and predominantly pediatric, reflecting the historical gender bias in diagnosis, which recognised the hyperactive, externally disruptive presentation far more readily than the inattentive presentation more common in girls, who are more likely to sit quietly and stare out the window while their minds moved in directions that had nothing to do with the lesson. That girl was not diagnosed. She was called a daydreamer, told she wasn't trying hard enough, and passed through school carrying the quiet conviction that everyone else had received an instruction manual she'd somehow missed. The expansion of adult diagnosis and the growing recognition of the inattentive subtype has produced a prescription population that is increasingly female, increasingly adult, and distributed across age groups nobody would have predicted from the 1980s diagnostic literature. The illegal market is harder to measure but not invisible. Survey data on non-prescribed stimulant use consistently shows that the college and young adult population is the largest non-medical market for amphetamine, with prevalence rates in some surveys running at 20 to 30% of college students reporting at least occasional non-prescribed use. Those numbers need careful handling. Occasional covers a wide range of behaviour, from the student who took a friend's pill once during finals and never repeated it, to the student sourcing a monthly supply since orientation. The range matters. But even accounting for imprecision, the non-prescribed stimulant market on American campuses is not marginal. It operates in the same libraries and study halls where legal prescriptions are also being taken, with the two populations largely indistinguishable from the outside. The population using illicit methamphetamine, crystal, not diverted prescription, is considerably smaller by number, but considerably more severely affected. Overdose and addiction rates have worsened significantly since the late 2010s, as fentanyl contamination has spread beyond the opioid supply into the stimulant supply in ways that public health agencies failed to anticipate. People who believe they are using methamphetamine are, in an increasing number of cases, using a product adulterated with a synthetic opioid, combining the cardiovascular stress of a stimulant with the respiratory depression of an opioid, in combinations the body is not built to survive. The deaths from this contamination are appearing in toxicology reports across the country and being undercounted in official statistics because the infrastructure for tracking stimulant-involved overdoses is less developed than the infrastructure for tracking opioid ones. What all of these populations share is a relationship to amphetamine, mediated by the same underlying pharmacology, the same dopamine release, the same norepinephrine surge, the same cardiovascular load, the same potential for tolerance and dependency and withdrawal, producing over time the same broad patterns that have characterized the drug since Gordon Alice noted he could not sleep on the evening of his self-experiment and filed it under somewhat inconvenient. The settings are different. The legal status is different. The social meaning is different. The price is different. The molecule is the same. Somewhere in the middle of 100 years of use, marketing, legislation, cultural debate, and moral panic, it is worth pausing to ask what amphetamine actually does, not to the pharmaceutical market or to national drug policy or to the communities that have been devastated by it, but to the brain, the 3-pound organ that is ultimately the thing being affected. The mechanism is, in its basics, relatively well understood, which is more than can be said for most of what has been discussed in the preceding 27 segments. Amphetamine increases the release of dopamine and norepinephrine in the brain, flooding the synaptic gap with neurotransmitters that are associated with attention, motivation, wakefulness, and the subjective experience of things mattering. In someone whose dopamine regulation is functioning within the typical range, this produces the focused, energized, appetite-suppressed state that users describe as being on, effective, alert, slightly narrowed in attention, and specifically less interested in anything that is not the immediate task. The background hum of distraction dims. The thing in front of you becomes the only thing. Whether that is useful depends entirely on whether the thing in front of you is a problem you need to solve, or a conversation you should be having with your child. In someone whose dopamine system is underactive, as is believed to be the case in ADHD, the same medication produces a paradoxically normalizing effect. The flood of dopamine brings the system up toward a baseline that makes sustained attention possible in a way it previously was not. The drug is not smart. It does not distinguish between these cases. It simply does what it does, in everyone, with the same chemical indifference. The shorter-term experience of amphetamine, as described by people across a century of use, has a consistent texture that does not vary greatly by era or social context. There is an initial period of heightened alertness and focused energy, usually beginning within 30 to 60 minutes of oral ingestion and lasting, depending on the formulation, somewhere between 4 and 12 hours. During this period, the appetite diminishes or disappears entirely. Food becomes an abstraction, something you know you should want but do not. The emotional tone is elevated, sometimes to the point of a mild euphoria, sometimes to a kind of flat, determined competence. The internal editor, that normally interrupts productive thought with doubts and distractions, moves to a quieter part of the brain. The connection between intention and action shortens. You sit down to do something and you do it, which sounds trivial until you've spent years sitting down to do something and doing something else for 3 hours instead. The longer-term effects of chronic amphetamine use are more complex and considerably less flattering. Repeated stimulation of the dopamine system produces adaptation. The brain, which is always working to maintain equilibrium, responds to the repeated dopamine flood by reducing its baseline dopamine production and by reducing the sensitivity of dopamine receptors. This is the neurological basis of tolerance. The same dose produces less effect over time because the system has recalibrated itself to expect the stimulation and has adjusted downward accordingly. It is also the neurological basis of the crash, the low mood, the fatigue, the inability to feel motivated or take pleasure in normal activities that follows extended or high-dose amphetamine use. The adapted brain, without the drug, is operating below the baseline it would have maintained if the drug had never been introduced. You feel worse than you felt before you started. This is not a moral failing or a weakness of character. It is a predictable neurological consequence of telling your brain repeatedly that it has more dopamine available than it actually does, and it is not communicated clearly enough to the patients who receive prescriptions or the young people who take pills from a friend during finals week. The cardiovascular effects are not trivial and not always adequately communicated to patients who receive prescriptions. Amphetamine raises blood pressure and heart rate. It does so acutely with every dose, in ways that are measurable and real, and that the body notices even if the person does not. It does so chronically in people who take it daily over extended periods, in ways that accumulate over time. The clinical significance varies considerably by individual. A 22-year-old with no cardiovascular risk factors is in a genuinely different situation than a 55-year-old with hypertension and a family history of cardiac events, but the risk is not zero for anyone, and it is elevated for populations in whom it is not always being adequately screened before prescriptions are written. The effects of amphetamine on the developing brain remain a subject of active research, genuine scientific uncertainty, and very little public discussion. Children who begin taking stimulant medications before the brain has completed its development, a process that continues into the mid-20s, are exposing a developing dopaminergic system to repeated stimulation during a period when that system is still being organized. Animal studies suggest that early stimulant exposure can alter the trajectory of dopaminergic development in ways that persist into adulthood. The human research is more equivocal, but equivocation is itself informative. We do not have strong evidence of harmlessness, and the absence of strong evidence of harm is not the same thing as evidence of safety. The long-term studies required to answer this question properly are extraordinarily difficult and expensive to conduct, and they have not been conducted at the scale required. The uncertainty is genuine. It is not communicated clearly in most conversations between pediatricians and parents. It deserves to be. A century after Gordon Alice injected himself in a Los Angeles laboratory and noted, with the careful understatement of a man trying to remain scientific, while his heart raced and his thoughts moved at a pace he had not previously experienced, that his nasal passages were very clear and that sleep appeared to be unavailable for the foreseeable future. Amphetamine remains one of the most prescribed, most used, most debated, and most genuinely complicated drugs in American life. The United States consumes more prescription amphetamines than any other country on earth, by margins that are not marginal, but enormous, and that have not narrowed despite 50 years of increasingly strict regulation and enforcement. The drugs are used to treat a genuine and widely prevalent neurological condition that causes real suffering and that responds to them in ways that improve the daily functioning of millions of people. They are also used in quantities that are difficult to measure precisely but impossible to dismiss by people who do not have that condition but who find the drugs useful in the same way that every other generation in the past 100 years has found them useful, because they are tired, because they are overwhelmed, because the distance between what they are expected to accomplish and what their unaided biology can deliver has grown wider than they know how to manage without assistance. The history that precedes this moment is not a simple cautionary tale, and treating it as one does a disservice both to the people who have been helped by these drugs and to the people who have been harmed by them. The soldier who took Benzedrine before a night march in 1944 and stayed alive because of it was not making a mistake. The child with ADHD who takes Adderall and can finally read a paragraph from beginning to end without losing the thread is not participating in a pharmaceutical conspiracy. The methamphetamine user in a rural community who developed a dependency that destroyed their employment and their family is not a moral failure. All three of these people encountered the same class of molecule under different circumstances, mediated by different social structures, with different results, and the difference in their outcomes reflects the difference in their circumstances as much as any property of the drug itself. The current state of the amphetamine landscape in the United States is, to put it gently, complicated in ways that resist simple description. The prescription market has recovered from the 2022 shortage and continues to operate at historically high levels, with the Telehealth channel adding a new stratum of patient access that is simultaneously a genuine expansion of care to underserved populations and a source of prescribing practices that federal investigators have found troubling. The illicit methamphetamine market is larger, cheaper, and more potent than at any previous point in American history, driven by large-scale production in Mexico using precursor chemicals sourced from China that entirely bypasses the domestic regulatory infrastructure that the Combat Methamphetamine Epidemic Act of 2005 was designed to protect. The overdose crisis, which has been the defining public health emergency of the last decade, and which has been driven primarily by synthetic opioids, fentanyl and its analogues in the illicit drug supply, has begun to intersect with stimulant markets in ways that public health officials describe as alarming, and that the existing response infrastructure is not well designed to address. The policy response to this landscape is, in most jurisdictions, approximately as effective as you would expect from a set of institutions that have been applying variations of the same basic approach, enforcement plus treatment, in a ratio that heavily favours enforcement for 5 consecutive decades without producing outcomes that satisfy anyone paying close attention. Drug arrests continue at rates that strain the criminal justice system and that fall disproportionately on communities of colour, despite drug use rates that do not significantly differ across racial groups. Treatment funding remains chronically insufficient relative to the scale of the need it is asked to address. The harm reduction infrastructure, needle exchanges, naloxone distribution, fentanyl test strips, exist in some jurisdictions, is politically prohibited in others, and is consistently underfunded everywhere it is permitted. The public conversation about stimulants continues to divide, with a sharpness that has not softened in 50 years along the line of the legal distinction. The prescribed Adderall is medicine, taken responsibly by people who need it. The illicit crystal methamphetamine is a plague consuming lives in communities that deserve better. Both of these things are true simultaneously. The fact that they are both amphetamines, that the pharmacological distance between them is considerably smaller than the cultural and legal and moral distance, is a fact that the conversation rarely makes room for, because making room for it requires asking questions that the available frameworks are not equipped to answer comfortably. And so, the frameworks persist, and the conversation circles, and the molecule continues to move through American life with the unhurried confidence of something that has been here before and fully expects to remain. What the current landscape makes clear is that the amphetamine story is not converging toward resolution. It is continuing, producing new chapters in the same pattern every decade since 1934, in which the drug proves useful, the usefulness is pushed past the point of safety, the harm becomes visible, the response arrives, the supply adapts, and the usefulness is rediscovered in a new context. 100 years of evidence suggests this is not a problem being solved. It is a condition being managed imperfectly by institutions that remain a step behind and a framework short. At the end of 100 years, the question that hangs over the entire history of amphetamine in America is not a simple one, and anyone who tells you otherwise has probably not been paying attention. The question is not whether these drugs work. They do, in specific contexts, for specific people, in ways that are measurable, real, and that a century of clinical and anecdotal evidence has made difficult to dismiss. The question is not whether they are dangerous. They are in specific contexts for specific people, in ways that are also measurable and real, and that the same century of evidence has made equally difficult to dismiss. These two things are simultaneously true. They have always been simultaneously true, and most of the arguments about amphetamine in American public life are arguments conducted by people who have decided that one of them is more true than the other, and who are looking for evidence to support the priority they have already assigned. The actual question is harder than either position allows for. It is something more uncomfortable, more structural, and more difficult to answer without implicating the entire architecture of how American life is organized. The question is this: what does it say about a society that its most reliable, most durable, most commercially successful solution to the problem of human exhaustion, inattention, and underperformance is a stimulant compound that it has been simultaneously prescribing and prohibiting, celebrating and criminalizing, exporting and outlawing for 100 consecutive years without interruption? What does it say about what we ask of people, about how much rest we allow, about the pace at which we have decided life should move, and the cost we are willing to impose on the people who cannot sustain that pace without chemical assistance? About the difference between treating a condition and treating a symptom of a condition that the culture itself is producing? These are not rhetorical questions. They are questions that researchers in public health, sociology, pharmacology, and economics have been asking with increasing urgency for at least 2 decades, and that the political system has not found a way to answer, because answering them would require changing things that powerful interests have a stake in not changing. The honest answer, as honest as 100 years of evidence permits, is that amphetamine's persistence in American life reflects something about American life that is not pharmaceutical in origin and cannot be addressed pharmaceutically. The demand that these drugs address, the demand for sustained performance, for extended wakefulness, for the suppression of the body's signals that it needs rest, is not a demand the drugs created. It is a demand the culture created, and it is a demand that the culture has consistently declined to reduce. The soldier who needed to march through the night was responding to a military institution that required him to march through the night. The housewife who needed to manage a household that expected too much of her was responding to a social structure that expected too much of her. The truck driver who needed to meet an impossible delivery deadline was responding to an economic system that had decided his time was worth optimizing past the point that human biology could naturally sustain. The student who needed to write 40 pages by Thursday morning was responding to an educational system that had not designed its demands around the actual limits of the people it was educating. All of them found in the same molecule a tool that made the demand temporarily meetable. None of their institutions revised the demand. This is the central irony that runs through the entire 100-year history. The drug that makes you feel capable of doing more has been used consistently and across every era to justify asking more of the people who take it, which creates the conditions that make the drug feel necessary, which makes the demand for it persistent, which makes the market for it enormous, which makes the regulation of it difficult, which makes the harm from it distributed across populations that had no particular reason to distrust something their physician prescribed, their sergeant handed them, their coach recommended, or their roommate offered across a library table at 2 a.m. during the week before finals. The loop does not close. This has not closed in 100 years. What would it take to close it? Not better scheduling categories or tighter prescribing guidelines, though those things matter at the margins. Not more enforcement, which has been tried with great consistency and has not produced the results that were promised when it was proposed. Not even better treatment, though better treatment would reduce suffering significantly, and its absence is a genuine policy failure. What it would require is a more honest accounting of what we are asking people to do, and a willingness to ask whether some portion of the tiredness and inattention and underperformance that we are medicating is not a disease to be treated but a signal to be listened to. A signal that says the pace is too fast, the demands are too many, the margin between what is expected and what is humanly possible has narrowed past the point where stimulants are a solution and has entered the territory where they are a symptom. That accounting has not been conducted at any scale that matches the scale of the problem. Amphetamine cannot conduct it. It can only postpone it. And it has been doing exactly that, with remarkable efficiency, for 100 years. The question is still waiting. And so here we are. You started this journey in a Los Angeles laboratory in 1927, standing next to a careful, methodical man who had just injected an unknown compound into himself on a Tuesday and was now unable to sleep and describing the experience in his notes as somewhat inconvenient. And you end it 100 years later, in a country where tens of millions of people will wake up tomorrow morning, reach for a small pill or capsule, and begin their day in a way that would have been medically unremarkable and pharmacologically identical to what soldiers, housewives, students, truck drivers, musicians, presidents, and athletes have been doing in various forms and for various reasons across every decade in between. That is a remarkable span of time for a single molecule to hold the attention of an entire civilization. Most drugs have shorter stories. Most stories have cleaner endings. Think about the people whose lives this history passed through. The soldier somewhere in the Pacific in 1944 handed a small tablet by his sergeant on the morning of an operation he was not certain he would survive, not asking what it was, because the question felt less important than what was coming. The housewife in 1958, standing in a kitchen that smelled like floor wax and fresh bread, taking her morning pill with a glass of water, and feeling for the next several hours like the life she'd been given might actually be manageable. The truck driver crossing Nevada in 1963, alone and behind schedule, the desert black outside his windows and the road ahead impossibly long, who understood perfectly well what he was doing and did it anyway because the alternative was falling asleep and not waking up. The child in 1997, 7 years old, for whom the world had been a place of constant noise and scrambled signals, and the persistent sense that everyone else had received instruction she had not, and for whom a small orange capsule made the classroom for the first time feel like somewhere she could stay. These are not stories about weakness. They're not stories about bad choices. They are stories about people trying to close the gap between what was being asked of them and what they were able to provide. They used the tools available to them. The tool that kept appearing across every era and in every context was the same one. That is worth sitting with for a moment before you fall asleep. The suffering that runs through this history is real, and it deserves acknowledgement. The communities hollowed out by methamphetamine, the dependencies that developed in people who were told they were simply taking their medicine, the people who encountered the drug in contexts that offered no safety net and no way back. That suffering is real, and it is part of the story, and it should not be papered over with the more comfortable parts. But so is the relief. The genuine, documented, life-changing relief that the same compound provided to the child who could finally read, the adult who could finally work, the soldier who survived a night he might not have otherwise survived. Both things live inside this history simultaneously, and neither one cancels the other out. What the 100 years of amphetamine in America leaves behind is not a lesson, exactly. Lessons imply that the story is over and that something has been learned in a form clean enough to be summarized. This story is not over, and what has been learned fits awkwardly into summaries. But if there is something to carry out of it, something to hold quietly in the dark before sleep comes, it might be this: that the tiredness people have been trying to chemically address for 100 years was never manufactured by the drug. The drug just made it briefly invisible. The tiredness was always real, and it belonged to real people, and those people deserved better answers than the ones they were given. They managed anyway, with what they had for as long as they could, which is the oldest and most human story there is. So tonight, as you pull your blanket a little higher and let the edges of the day soften, take a moment to think about all the people across the last century who are simply trying to keep up, who are tired and overwhelmed and doing their best in circumstances that did not ask whether their best was reasonable to expect. Think about the soldier who just wanted to stay awake long enough to come home, the housewife who just wanted to feel like herself for a few hours, the kid in the back of the classroom who just wanted the noise in her head to quiet down enough to hear the lesson. They were not so different from you. They were just people, trying to get through the day. And with that thought, let the day go. You have made it through. The lights are low, the world is quiet, and nothing that exists in the history of amphetamine or in the weight of this particular century requires your attention right now. Sleep well.